everyone. Welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. For decades, Iraq was firmly anchored in the socialist camp. Its vocal anti-Western rhetoric and policies earned it high marks from the Soviet Union and the wrath of Washington. The US-led war on Iraq may have changed all that. Political experts believe that Iraq has joined the Western camp for good. Other scholars, however, contend that Iraqi nationalism and regional politics will swing Iraq's political campus eastward once again. The contest between capitalism and communism is now part of history. So what will determine whether Iraq will adopt moderate or radical policies, Iraqi interests or regional conflicts?
Iraq's future political orientation is coming into question with the looming deadline for the withdrawal of US combat troops from Iraq's cities. Iraqi forces will assume responsibility for security in urban areas from June the 30th, the date when US combat troops must leave Iraqi cities. Iraq's new security role is drawing into focus the likely political orientation which it may choose to follow. Not just internally, where Iraqi politics remain bedeviled by ethnic and sectarian tensions, but also regionally. Some believe the US-led invasion has won Iraq back into the arms of the West, and that Iraq will join the camp of other Arab allies to the US, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Kuwait. Others believe the US occupation has led to a resurgence of Iraqi nationalism and sectarian identity, which could push Iraq into political alliance with the likes of Syria and even Iran. Iraq is of immense geostrategic importance. It is rich in oil, centered at the heart of the Gulf, and sits next door to Iran. For that reason, the stakes are becoming higher. A spate of attacks in April and May seem to be aimed at stoking sectarian tension and undermining public confidence ahead of the deadline for US combat troops to leave Iraqi cities. Despite this violence, the US military recently claimed that high-profile attacks in Iraq have fallen nearly 60% in the past year. On the political front, national reconciliation remains unfulfilled as divisions continue over constitutional reforms and the distribution of power, influence and oil revenue. Although Iraq's Shia-dominated government remains weak, it must chart a political course for the country. Something which could be difficult and dangerous in a region of instability and heightened tensions.
To explore which way Iraq's political pendulum will swing in the next phase, I'm delighted to welcome from Beirut, Michael Hudson, Director of Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and from Moscow, Vitaly Naumkin, President of the International Center for Strategic and Political Studies, and from Paris, Alain Grèche, Deputy Director of Le Monde Diplomatique. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Vitaly Naumkin, Iraq was anchored in the socialist camp for decades. Has all that gone with the 2003 war, or will somehow one day it will swing at least to the east?
No, first of all, given this old time of confrontation of bipolar world, Iraq has never been a part of this socialist world, and especially if we speak in the terms of communism and capitalism. The Iraqi nationalism was always anti-communist. But to be a bit provocative about what we are going to do now, if yesterday it was between the United States and the Soviet Union, now I think it's more between the United States and Iran, probably. That's the question. Where is Iraq now? Because the Iranian influence, I think, is the most important factor if we can compare it with what the Soviet Union did in Iraq.
Before we talk about perhaps the next phase where Iran and the United States compete for Iraq, and that may have, perhaps will remind us of history, Michael Hudson, looking back at the relationship between Baghdad and Moscow, was that a good relationship, and what can you do better for Iraq?
Well, I think from the point of view of the Soviet Union at the time, it was a good relationship. It wasn't perfect because, as Professor Naumkin rightly says, the Iraqis were not by any means just totally clients of communism, but there was a certain strategic alliance, an alliance of convenience between them, and that made life hard for the United States. It certainly, Iraq was on the other side, And the United States, I think, greatly regretted the good old days, that is to say the days before 1958, when after all, for a time, we had an alliance called the Baghdad Pact, which was designed, of course, to contain Soviet expansion into the region. Now, of course, the Baghdad Pact and its successor, CENTO, have completely gone into the wastebasket of history, and we're looking at a new situation. And I think basically to answer the question which way Iraq is going to go, I think we need to look at the social and economic basis from which the new Iraqi leadership is emerging in the post-2003 period.
To complete the picture, Alain Gresh, Iraq had a special relationship with France of all the Western countries. Perhaps we'll remind our viewers that there was a special relationship between late Saddam Hussein and Jacques Chirac. French Total did a brisk business in Iraq, and French language was introduced as the second foreign language in Iraqi school. Has that all gone, or will France make a determined effort to reclaim some of its influence and interest in Iraq?
I think it will reclaim its influence and we will come to it. But I just want to make one point concerning history. In this time when the relation between Iraq and France were so good in the 70s and the 80s, it was a time in which, I mean, I don't think we can say that Iraq had anything to do with revolutionary policy or even the Soviet Union. I mean, it was a time where not only Saddam Hussein, who came to the power as a one-man leader at the end of the 70s, was repressing the Communist Party, but he was making the war against Iraq, against Iran, with the support of all the conservative monarchies of the Gulf. So it is much more complicated than the fact that during the 60s and 70s, Iraq was with the socialist camp, and now it's changing. Iraq has had a very complicated policy during all these 30 years. And of course, the relation with France was part of this policy.
Despite the measure of independence Iraq had, Vitaly, and yet it had a strong relationship with Moscow, with the Soviet Union, simply because, you know, it was the major supplier of arms in addition to France.
Right. It was so, that was the reason why there were a lot of debts accumulated by Iraq, but all the debts were just not paid. But Russia decided not to ask for this for the payment of debts, and this is one of the most important concessions of Moscow, I think, to modern Iraq. You know, it's very important that Russia decided, to not to ask for this.
Michael Hudson mentioned perhaps the next phase of competition is going to be between Washington and Tehran over influence in Iraq, and that will remind us of history, Vitaly. If you remember, Iraq was the football between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. Change the names into Tehran and Washington, and history will repeat itself.
Yes, but Iraq was, to a certain extent, the new customer for the Soviet Union, starting from 1958. And when Abdul Karim Qasim came to power, when it was the monarchy was overthrown in Iraq, so Russia was on the brink of almost war with the United States, because if we now analyze the archives in Moscow, there were acute debates in the Politburo what to do if the Americans and the British can invade Iraq. It was very serious.
As a matter of fact, it was more than just an invasion. Record also tell us that President Eisenhower, as a matter of fact, has authorized the CIA to take out Abdul Karim Qasim, but that is for another episode, perhaps. Yeah. Michael Hudson, you mentioned the new phase, and let me just remind our viewers that the recent visit by the Turkish President Abdullah Gül to Syria with Bashar al-Assad, they talked about a quartet alliance, and that is between Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Will that have any traction, and will that have a measure of anti-Americanism in it?
Well, I think, Jassim, that the Obama administration is quite worried about how to get out of Iraq in a proper way. And so it's a very ambiguous situation.
Without leaving it to Iran, is that possible?
without leaving it to Iran. So in a way, if there is a quartet of regional powers, maybe that is helpful because some of those powers, such as Turkey, are actually quite friendly with the United States. But I think on balance, the Americans are looking at the situation in Iraq and hoping that things will come together when the Iraqis have their next election. But at the moment, I think it is a little bit unclear, and there are factions and factors that are powerful in Iraq that are not necessarily going to be very sympathetic to the United States. So I do think that the dream of the previous Bush administration, the neoconservatives, which was a dream that Iraq could be reconstructed strategically the way it was before 1958, is really nothing more than a dream, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, I'll take a short response from Alan and Vitaly about the same question. How realistic, Alan, is that for the U.S. to leave Iraq without depositing it in the lap of Iran? Once power is gone, it's only a matter of time before Iran fills that vacuum.
But look, I don't think we can look at the world like we look, I mean, two big powers, Soviet Union and United States, one big power. I think all this is changing. Now we have a multipolar world in which Turkey has an independent policy, which is at the same time in alliance with the United States, but which have its own aims and its own strategy. I think it's true for many countries. I don't think we will see any country now in the Middle East completely aligned on the American position.
Vitaly, before you comment also about the same question, can perhaps we bring in the question of oil? Iraq is reputedly to be the second largest reservoir of oil. And if I remind my viewers, perhaps for the last time, the PhD doctorate by the late Russian President Gromyko was, back even in the late 30s, the influence and the impact of Gulf oil on world politics. Go ahead, Vitaly.
Yeah, I think first of all, there are two important points. The first point is that we don't know what the Americans are going to do in Iraq, whether it's a withdrawal of forces or a deployment or reduction of forces. I'm not sure about the withdrawal. So the Americans are not withdrawing from Iraq, and the influence, the American influence will remain there, despite the fact that the Iraqi government wants to distance itself a bit from the alliance with the United States for some tactical reasons. I think, first of all, there is one poisoning factor in this region. It's the Kurdish factor, both for Turkey, first of all, dividing Turkey and Iraq, and then influencing its relationship with Syria and Iran. We don't know what's going to happen there.
Michael Hudson, let me stay with the oil sector. Can Russia come in through the back door of Iraq through oil? Russia is one of the largest exporters of oil, and oil will have only increased prominence and importance in the future. And before the 2003, Iraq signed a $100 billion contract with Russia, and that has not been honored yet.
Well, and I don't know that it's going to be honored, but I think the oil, the distribution or the direction of Iraqi oil resources is still up for grabs. And there are, after all, in Iraq today, nationalists who feel that it is not right simply to invite, without a lot of restrictions, foreign companies to be coming in. So I don't think that the United States, even though, as Vitaly says, we will probably keep a fairly substantial force in the country for a while, I'm not sure that that is going to give us the leverage to allow American companies to have exclusivity in the oil relationship with Iraq.
Alan Gresh, the elephant in the room is Palestine and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And if the continuous uninterrupted political support by the successive American administration to Israel continues, that only is going to rub the Iraqis, the Iraqi nationalism, the wrong way. And it's only a question of time before somehow they revolt about this alliance with Washington.
I think one of the main lessons of 6 years of American war is the fact that the Iraqi nationalism is still here, and the Americans were not able to crush it. And on the oil question, it was very clear. I mean, one of the main aims of the American administration was to have a new oil law to permit foreign companies to work freely in Iraq. And this was not possible, even with this government. And of course, the Palestinian question and the fact that there is no solution in Palestine not only make it impossible, the fact, I don't know if you remember, but in 2003, the neoconservatives were hoping or dreaming that Iraq will be the second Arab country after Egypt to have diplomatic relations with Israel. I think this is completely out of the picture today. And again, I mean, nationalism will be a main force in the future, not only in Iraq, but it will be in Iraq. And this will be a very big problem for the Americans, especially if they keep their forces.
I think I agree completely with Alain on that point. And the difficulty that the Obama administration faces in keeping a substantial but still lower troop level there is that I think this is likely to fan the flames of a kind of a renewed Iraqi nationalism. Up to now, of course, Iraq has been quite fragmented, and we've seen that the new government has been dominated largely by Shiite parties, some of which are strongly influenced by Iran. But I think that underneath it all, as Alain, I think, correctly points out, there is an Iraqi nationalism. And by and large, the people that are going to be running Iraq, whether we're talking about Shiite groups or Sunni groups or nationalist or secular groups or even Kurdish groups, these are not going to belong to the same kind of upper bourgeois, upper class that supported Iraq back in the old days before 1958, and which allowed Iraq to fit rather comfortably into an Anglo-American sphere of influence.
Since we're talking about the past and the present, Vitaly Naumkin, one is almost surprised how accurate the mirror image of today is with the past. The 1958 and perhaps what Michael mentioned, the Baghdad Pact split the Arab world into Western allied as vis-a-vis the Soviet Union allied. Now we are talking about moderates and radicals. Will Iraq become a version of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait and Bahrain, or it's only a question of time before it joins Syria and Algeria and Libya and perhaps even Egypt after a fashion?
I think it's quite possible, and we can say that, yes, there is an Iraqi nationalism. But I think that a part of this Iraqi nationalism, there are a lot of, sectarian loyalties, and these sectarian loyalties sometimes, in my view, are, if not more important than the Iraqi nationalism, but not less important, And given that, and given the growing influence of Islamism, of Islamic activism, we can say that especially given the absence of solution for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, any hopes for the quick establishment of the independent Palestinian state. Given that, I believe that the radical forces will still stay important and strong, and probably be stronger in Iraq.
Well, if I could just add a point to what Vitaly was saying, I've been very recently traveling in the Gulf area, and I must say there are many people, I think, in the political elites of those countries who are very worried that Iraq may, in fact, fall too much under Iranian influence or under other kinds of radical influences. And I don't think very many people out on the Arab side of the Gulf feel that it is likely that Iraq will join them. They don't feel, I think, so far, that Iraq would join this kind of what is emerging as a sort of a pro-American alliance of Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian Authority, and so forth, in a kind of a new sort of status quo position over and against the Iranian-backed, more radical elements. I think they fear that Iraq, might come too much under Iranian influence, and that will be bad for their security, and B, Iraqi nationalism will be much more radical than the Saudis, for example.
Yes, I'm not sure there is, this split between conservative or moderate and radical, it's a part true and part not true. In this, what called radical, we have Qatar, which has a more important American military base. We have seen in the recent week a relation coming back between Saudi Arabia and Syria. I think it's much more complicated than only radical and conservative. I think today Egypt is quite isolated, even from what we call the moderate camp. Many things will depend on the policy of the American administration towards the Palestinian question and towards Iran. And we feel that among some Gulf countries, there are some fears that this betterment of relation between Iran and United States could be detrimental to their relation. So I think it's a much more complicated picture than only radical and moderate.
Vitaly, from your vantage point of view in Moscow, has the die been cast? Is Iraq beyond redemption from the influence of Iran from Moscow's Politburo point of view?
No, you know, I see that the Iranian influence will remain very strong in Iraq. Of course, there is a collision of nationalisms, Iraqi nationalism, Iranian nationalism, and we know that during the Iraqi-Iranian war, all hopes of each side rely upon its co-believers on the other side. For the Iraqis, it was to rely upon the Arabs in Iran, for the Iranians to rely upon Shia factions in Iraq. No, it was not feasible, you know. So the hopes failed because the nationalism were much stronger. But it was during the war. Now I think the Iranian influence will remain very important in Iraq, especially if the American influence, the American presence becomes less or reduced in this country.
Michael, a final question, make it as quick as you can. We talked about nationalism. Once, let's hope and keep our fingers crossed that the Palestine question is settled, there is an Arab backyard for Syria, and that is 35 years of Baathism in Iraq created a big grassroots. Will that somehow, the Syrian, pull Iraq out of the control of the Iranians and revert back to Arab nationalism?
Well, I don't know that the Syrians have that kind of leverage over the new Iraq. Clearly, they, like everybody else among the neighbors, are playing a role, but I don't think that they can actually, or would actually, try to pull Iraq away from Iran. After all, Syria itself has quite a durable tactical or strategic relationship with Iran.
Michael Hudson, Vitaly Naumkin, Alan Gresh, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. Next week, we will take another look inside Iraq. Until then, have a great week.